My husband's mistress deliberately shot my daughter. He sent me to a mental hospital because he was afraid I would get into trouble. On Christmas Eve, Antonio Carlson's secretary's daughter, Maria Carlson, intentionally set off fireworks to burn my daughter, Amy Carlson. I tried to call the police, but he broke my phone. Then he scolded me. Julia is not like that. Why did she abuse the children? Fearing that I would disturb Evelyn and Julia, Antonio sent me to a mental hospital. Later, Julia becomes seriously ill and ends up in the hospital, and Antonio is very worried that her hair will turn gray overnight. It didn't matter. He finally let me go. Amy is dead. Don't remember the past. You have good medical skills. I have confidence in your medical skills. I didn't say anything, but a shadow of hatred flashed in my eyes. His mistake was that he thought he could reason with a psychopath. Chapter 1 I don't like Julia. At a young age, he lied, was deceitful, jealous, and often threatened Amy behind her back. Whenever I complained to Antonio, he always scolded me. You are so shallow, you look down on Julia because she comes from a broken family. Her mother may be my secretary, but everyone is equal and no one is important, so stop making fun of her. I felt angry, upset, and helpless whenever Julia bullied Amy. She was always the first victim. Before Amy could cry, Julia and Evelyn were already upset. This made Antonio feel sorry for them. He would also give something to Evelyn and Julia. Even though Antonio believed in Julia's innocence, I tried to keep Amy away from her. But on Christmas Eve, when I came home from my shift at the hospital, Amy had an accident. Holding Amy's burned and deformed body, I wanted to dismember Julia. Amelia, Antonio. Not me. I warned Amy not to play with fire, but she didn't listen and pushed me away. Julia hides behind Evelyn, looking innocent, and shows us a line on her hand. Her tear-stained eyes almost broke Antonio's heart. Mrs. Carlson, Amy is your precious daughter, but Julia is also my daughter. He doesn't have a father and he's a coward. He can't intentionally set fires to kill people. Evelyn hid Amy behind her. His shoulders are shaking slightly, and it's hard not to feel sorry for him. Something in his words must have inspired Antonio. He immediately took the first aid kit and treated Julia's injuries. He scolded me shamelessly. Don't make baseless accusations. Can't you see that Julia is afraid of you? I angrily banged my fist on the table. I called the video from the door monitor. Julia, to prevent something like this from happening again, I secretly installed a small camera outside a few days ago. The video clearly shows Julia's behavior. Antonio was surprised. Julia panicked, clenching her thighs as tears streamed down her face. It wasn't my fault. Amy said her clothes were better than mine and that I was a fatherless child. I wanted to burn her clothes. I didn't want to kill her. Poor kid, I believe you. Antonio's expression softened and he quickly picked her up and calmed her down, but when Julia noticed Evelyn's subtle gaze, she understood and rejected it. He smiled, pretending to be obedient and discreet. Antonio, I don't blame Melia. He was sad about Amy's death. Melia, don't be sad. Suddenly Julia ran to hug me. A strange smile appeared on his young face, and he whispered in my ear, it's a pity your monitor couldn't record this sound. Amy cried so pitifully when she died. From now on, I will take Amy's place and be Antonio's son, enjoying everything she has, including the shares Antonio left her. You want it? I'll call the police and have you arrested for this dirty trick, you idiot. I got angry and pushed him away and hit him hard. Julia. Evelyn hugged Julia and cried out in pain. His eyes filled with hatred and he looked at me. Mrs. Carlson, I know you look down on us and you blame Julia when something happens, but she's still a child and we have no one, so you can't torture her. Julia has felt guilt and fear since Amy died. Can't you see how scared she is? She almost had another heart attack. I looked coldly at Julia's pale face. I smiled and picked up the phone to call the police. The next moment, Antonio snatched the phone from my hand. He looked at Julia with deep concern. His face darkened when he saw me. That's enough. Amy is dead. Julia, what's the point of being responsible? Will it bring him back? In the end, that wasn't Julie's intention. Forget it, it was just kindness. Chapter 2 Didn't he do this on purpose? So does Amy deserve to die? Antonio, Amy was burned alive by him. How could you say such heartless words? I have never hated him more than in that moment. Ignoring his objections, I picked up the phone and called the police. When the police arrived, I realized it was okay. The officer in charge was one of Antonio's friends. They didn't give me a chance to speak. After talking to Antonio for a while, the police left. I completely lost control and punched and kicked him in frustration. How could you do this? Amy is dead, but you are protecting the real criminal. Amy is watching from heaven. How can you live in peace? Antonio knew he was wrong and allowed me to vent my anger. When I finally ran out of strength, he tapped me on the shoulder and tried to calm me down. The body is here. You can take care of Amy's funeral. Julia is very scared. I will take her to the hospital for an examination. He didn't hesitate for a moment. Holding Julia in his arms, he walked past Amy's body, pausing for a moment before walking away. I looked at him, who turned back in shock. Julia and Evelyn looked back at me and smiled. I gritted my teeth in hatred and wanted to rush out and throw everyone together. But now I have to put Amy to bed properly. We'll take care of the rest later. Amy's funeral will be held on the third day. Antonio never showed up, never. Even called. I controlled my anger and called him. Sorry honey, Julia's heart condition is getting worse. Evelyn can't do this alone. You have to take care of Amy's affairs. I immediately hung up the phone. I don't have the strength to argue with him. I buried Amy's ashes and went home. I noticed that Amy's room had been robbed. I was angry. I ran into the room, grabbed Julia, and asked loudly, did you go to Amy's room? Did you take her necklace? During the conversation, I noticed a bracelet with precious stones on her wrist. An unpleasant feeling immediately hit me in the chest. Melia, you scared me. Antonio, help. Julia panicked and tried to close the bracelet, but I held his wrist tightly, and he managed to cry out helplessly. Antonio and Evelyn ran out of the office, still a little embarrassed seeing my vile appearance. Antonio quickly pulled Julia with him and started shouting at me, Milia Carlson, that's enough. You're blaming her like a madman before you even know what happened. Amy's room is not used at all. What's the problem if Julia goes there and plays something? You scared her. The fortune teller said that this would affect Amy's luck, so I used Amy's chain to make a bracelet for Julia. This will be for Amy's benefit and help her accumulate luck in her next life. Antonio presented it as the most reasonable thing in the world. I found it unreasonable. Meaning? No one can confiscate your belongings. I took it, I let my emotions take over and pulled the bracelet from Julia's wrist in fear. His wrists were red from my scratches. Milia, it hurts so much, stop hitting me. Julia's performance was much less convincing than Evelyn's. He cried for a long time, but did not shed a tear. Evelyn, on the other hand, is very experienced. As Antonio watches, he throws himself against the wall. I can't live like this. Mrs. Carlson, if you want someone to pay for Amy's death, take my life. Evelyn, don't do this. Antonio's eyes widened in surprise, her face turned pale, and she went up to him and hugged him. The whole room was filled with crying and all I could feel was my anger. Stop pretending. If you want to die, die. I picked up the vase and prepared to throw it at them. Evelyn and Julia hug, clearly scared. Antonio was faster than me. He snatched the vase from my hand and hit me over the head with a wooden chair. You're crazy. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was Antonio's angry face, scolding me through gritted teeth. When I woke up, I was chained to a bed in a mental hospital. There is no gemstone bracelet. He looked at me and sighed helplessly. The only way to keep Evelyn and Julia safe is to lock you up here. Don't blame me. I didn't look at him until his figure disappeared behind the door. I laughed deeply inside. I know he will come back and beg me to leave. Chapter 3. While in the mental hospital, I followed all the rules, but personally, I would throw the medicine away. Not only did I avoid pain, but I also got benefits I didn't expect. Finally, in the second month, Antonio arrived. We haven't seen each other for a while. His hair was completely gray, and his face was covered with fine wrinkles and fatigue. For the first time, he lowered his usual arrogance in front of me, and there was a pleading tone in his voice. Milia, Julia's heart condition is deteriorating. The doctor said she needs open heart surgery, which is very risky, but only you can do it. If you save her, you will be blessed. Please put aside your personal grudges and gather some blessings for Amy's next life. I have been silent for a long time. Just when Antonio thought I wouldn't agree and was ready to try again, a nurse came in with some medication. This is the moment I've been waiting for. I immediately started to tremble all over, pretending to be scared and hiding behind Antonio. I agree. Please let them go. I don't want to take drugs. Antonio's eyes lit up and a satisfied smile appeared on his face. He didn't suspect me. He arranged for me to be discharged from the hospital the same day. Upon arriving home, Amy's room was redecorated. Everything in it belongs to Juliet. I suppressed the hatred in my heart and hesitated before speaking. But I have a psychiatric report and I can't operate now. It's easy. I'll ask someone to give you a new ID. You can use it to untie Julia. Send these people your personal information and they will take care of it. Antonio saw that I wasn't causing any trouble, so he confidently sent me the contact information of the person who helped me get a new ID. He didn't know that this would be the biggest regret of his life. A few days before the operation, I noticed that Antonio had begun to appear publicly at work with Evelyn. Now everyone is seeing clearly. Evelyn has taken on the role of the female boss of the company. Before, he always pretended that he didn't know anything, but now he was too lazy to act. Across from me, he whispered in Antonio's ear, Antonio, I'm still worried. Milia wants Julia dead. Do you really think he would do this for her? Antonio heard that and looked at me thoughtfully. On the day of the operation, he not only wore a surgical gown to supervise the operation, but also hired many experts to observe me. Their fears were not unfounded. After all, I hated Julia and let her die without hesitation, but with my psychological experience, I wasn't afraid of anything. I didn't even go to the police station. So, I secretly hid the scalpel on my sleeve. When the operation reached its most critical moment, I used all my strength to stab Julia's still beating heart. Antonio and the expert were surprised by my sudden move. But I pretended nothing happened and continued the operation. After that, the operation went well. Antonio let out a sigh and smiled, thanking me, but when they asked to stitch the wound, Julia died of a broken heart. Milia, you must take revenge and deliberately kill Julia. I will call the police. As soon as I walked out of the operating room, Evelyn ran towards me with a horrified look on her face. I quickly grabbed it and smiled coldly, pointing at Antonio behind me. I didn't. If you don't believe me, you can ask him. I wanted Julia to die, but I never had the chance, did I? Tears are streaming from Antonio.